Hey Podcast Babe, welcome to season 9 of the Podcast Babes podcast. My name is Anna Klasse, host of this pod and founder of the Podcast Babes. Every week, I interview and inspire a female podcaster here who has made her podcast work for her and her business. So tune in to learn from her mistakes, create your own profitable podcast. Here's today's episode. Hello, Podcast Babes. Today I'm here with Kris Ward, productivity coach, team building specialist, and systems strategist, and also the host of Win the Hour, Win the Day podcast, a podcast with almost 250 episodes. So I'm super excited to learn from Kris today. First of all, welcome to the show, Kris.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm pumped to be here.
Yeah, me too. So can you tell us a little bit more about you, your business, and also your podcast?
Yeah, so I help entrepreneurs stop working so hard. My clients tell me they get 25 hours back a week within the first month of working with us. And we help them with their team, their time, and their toolkits. And we help them find, hire, and onboard virtual assistants. And then we set them up successfully with their super toolkit so that they just get more and more time back on their calendar, make more money, stop being the bottleneck, and just, have the business and the life that they were promised. And more than anything, have a business that supports their life instead of consuming it.
Amazing. Very impactful work. And how does your podcast fit in with that? Because I think, you probably have a lot to share. So why did you decide that a podcast was the way to do that?
Yeah. So as a guest on a lot of podcasts, I was told again and again I should have a podcast. And I remember thinking, dude, this is not so silly. This was like almost 5 years ago now. And I was thinking, does the world need another podcast? Have we missed the boat on that? I was so wrong. So anyhow, I got talked into having one and I was like, okay. And here is where it gets really interesting. And I think my example is really helpful and different than what's out there is that I didn't want to have a podcast about productivity and efficiency because I feel the people who need me most are not listening to that kind of stuff. The problem with most of my clients is they look good on paper. Maybe they have a podcast or a book or whatever. It's just that where they are in their journey, they're working too many hours. And they keep thinking once they get past this next thing, like, oh, once I just get the website fixed or the new client on board or all these things, they think they'll then be fine. And how long have they been saying that? 5-10 years, right? So it kind of reminds me of like, I love to think about fitness and vitality. So I'll listen to fitness and vitality podcasts, but people who have health issues or who are not exercising are not listening to those. So in my case, I started a podcast and I just made it a general business. It could be anything from sales to social media. And so I have people come on my show. They have to have tangible takeaways. My show is really about, we've got almost 1,500 5-star reviews. And people say all the time, they like how they can listen to the show and then go try whatever was on the show, like immediately, right? So we do that. So then you might say, well, Kris, why do you have a podcast that's very broad and not in your niche? Well, it allows me to have meaty, meaningful conversations with people I would never get the opportunity to. A lot of them then get understanding what I do. So some of them have become clients for sure. Others have, now spread the word of, hey, because all my clients are kind of like in secrecy, isolated, thinking they're the only one struggling with this, if they were just more organized, whatever, right? I really see it more as a funnel and a way to have meaningful relationships and then have something to offer. Like I can reach out to somebody on LinkedIn and say, hey, you're doing really good in your videos. Would you like to be on my show? Versus let's get on a Zoom call, have a coffee and collaborate. Like what do you want? That doesn't resonate as well, right? So I found it when it's done well, it's a powerful networking tool.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm hearing you say is that on one hand, it's meeting your audience where they are hanging out online, right? So meeting ideal clients, not when they're searching for what you offer, but even before that. And then the other thing is just really powerful networking, a networking tool to meet new people, new clients, or maybe referral partners as well. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then you also have something to offer. It's not like I need something from you. It's like, hey, would you like to be in my podcast? And then I can start listening to amazing people. We've had some really incredible people on my show. Kevin Harrington, original shark from Shark Tank, James Malinchak, ABC Secret Millionaire, co-author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Marcus Sheridan, like a whole bunch of really powerful, influential people in my world. And so then somebody goes, oh, yes, I think I'd like to be on your show. And so now we're starting off with, and I'll say to them, we have a waiting list, but I saw your videos on LinkedIn. They're really good. So it just allows me to have a reason to enter the room in a discussion. And so again, and this is where I think most people do it wrong. Do I care if people listen to my show? Yes, it is flattering. And I'm always surprised when people say, oh, I've been listening to your show every week. I'm like, really? But if no one listened to that show, we do have a good following, but if no one listened to that show and it was only the people I was meeting and the people they're introducing me to, it'd still be fine by me.
Yeah, exactly. That's really cool. So now you have all these big names on the podcast and you have a waiting list of guests, but I'm sure that's not how you started, right? Everyone needs to start with step one. And I think you mentioned that before. For you, it was 5 years ago when you were basically talked into starting this podcast. How was that first phase of starting it, though? You mentioned that you already had some experience being a guest, but how was that launching phase of the show?
Well, so if you know anything about me, we're all about systematizing. We've got our signature super toolkit. So I will say, I didn't even see it. Someone on my team said, well, why don't we look at our super toolkit for launching the book? I bet you there's a lot of things similar. And so we did. And so really sped that up. It's like, okay. So we just followed that. What I would say too is people are pretty generous. I had reached out to some people I'd been on their show or some industry thought leaders and said, I'm starting a podcast. I'm wondering if you'd be part of the launch, one of my first guests, and it'd be a big honor for me. And you ask somebody nicely and you flatter them enough and you can guilt them into coming on the show. So I definitely did that. So that helped. And of course, someone said to me, which I thought was kind of annoying at the time, but he said, you'll be about 50 episodes before you know what you're doing. So the beginning of the show, I dove into like what everybody else did, tell us your backstory, and so that we all can see entrepreneurs climb mountains and we're all relatable. And you know what? That wasn't my jam. I like just to get to the stuff. Like, let's dive in. I do, frankly, almost no intro now or a very short intro if they've got something spectacular. So it just evolved to finding my own voice like anything else and what it is I wanted to do. So there's that. But you know what? It's a conversation. And the beautiful thing about a podcast is it's just a conversation. So if you stumble your words or you mess things up or you talk over each other, it has a different feel to it. And people say that to me all the time. They feel like they're in the room. She says, I feel like I'm just sitting there having a coffee with you and you're talking to somebody else. So the flaw and the real of it makes it easy to record and makes it desirable to the audience. So don't overthink it.
Yeah, exactly. It's so interesting that you said that the advice that you didn't really want to hear, and it was kind of true that you had to find your own voice. And it makes sense, right? When we start a new project, you just automatically look at other people, what they're doing, and then just start there and then go from there to find your own voice.
Yeah.
That's really interesting that worked for you like that as well. I think that's really good advice, for anyone listening. It will take time, and it's probably, I mean, I cringe when I listen to my own first episode, and I think it's a good thing because that means that you've grown and that you found that voice. But also, having a conversation on a podcast, I feel like it's also a skill, right? Even though it is just a conversation, it gets easier the more you do it.
Well, people sometimes flatter me and say that I'm a really good host, but frankly, I just pick things that I'm really interested in. And there has to be a bridge of learning. So if somebody wants to be on the show that's something similar to me, it's not that I don't want them talking to my audience. It's that I will agree with a lot with what you say, and that does not make for an interesting conversation. So I do pick people where I can learn from. So that's another thing. I often get free coaching on a call going, oh, I never thought of that. I never thought of that for my business, or we never do that, or we should be doing that more. And so many times I leave with what I call actionable items and having to do something. So free coaching, powerful networking, building relationships, possible clients. It's a win-win-win for me.
Yeah, definitely. So in the 5 years of podcasting, have you also encountered any challenges? Because, podcasting, it has a lot of benefits, but I think for many business owners, it's not easy.
No, I think what happens there, and this leans into what we do. So we help entrepreneurs stop working so hard. I think there's staggering numbers, like something like 97% of podcasters don't make you past week 3. And I would argue that's just because they don't have the system set up. It takes me about 6 minutes to process our podcast, and then my team about one person about an hour and I'd say 15 minutes. It takes, I think, most people between 3 and 6 hours. If they're really got it dialed in, it might be three, or they're paying somebody else to do it. It's pretty expensive. So I think the problem is, though, I would argue like, oh, if you can't take on that podcast, it means you can't take on writing a book or promoting it. There's all these things you can't take on. So everything I do in business, anything you do is only going to create more work. So when I finished my book, Win the Hour, Win the Day, oh my gosh, I thought they should have a parade in my honor. I got a book done. Phew, we're done. Well, no, now I have to pitch to be on shows, and then I have to be on the shows, and all those things eat up time on my calendar. So yeah, having a podcast does take some time, and then networking and following up on all these things. Of course it takes time, but you can compress that time. And if you can't, you've got a bigger issue, because that means you can't take on any more projects or any more ambitions, and you can't grow your business. So for me, it was not an issue, because that's what we do. We help other businesses, entrepreneurs, coaches, consultants do the same thing. But it's just a matter of having a setup that will allow you to lean into your next ambition.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Yeah, look into those systems, set that up. But I think what I'm also hearing you say is that you had very realistic expectations on what it took to make that podcast work. And correct me if I'm wrong, but also that you knew, okay, this is the challenge, because this, most of the podcasters, they fall off after a few weeks. So we shouldn't do that, right? Like, we need to set up those systems, because obviously it's what you do, but also because there is that risk of, okay, well, if we don't do this, we're going to end up like every other podcaster. And then after, I think the average is actually 7 episodes, they never post anything again, because they get overwhelmed. They don't have those systems set up. So I think that's a really good takeaway for sure.
Yeah, there was somebody on Facebook who was doing one of those clickbait things, and they said, I've been on 300 podcasts. Do you want my list? So I thought, for sure. And I knew him. I downloaded it, and I had my team look at it, because I thought, well, I'll see to be able, I'll go on the podcast he was on, because we were kind of we had a similar audience. And I looked, and there was like 300. And I bet you we stopped around 75, because out of the 75, 60 were no longer. So he may have been on that podcast 2 years ago, but they're gone now, right? So that is the thing. Yeah. I don't know how to do anything without a system, because we just do it and then we move on to the next thing. So we're not repeating our work. We're always taking on new work. But that is the crippling factor. Also, people thinking that when they put this big message out there, oh, I'm on a podcast, people hear my voice, and the business will just rain on me, like overflow with new clients. You can't be doing it for that reason. It just doesn't work that way.
Exactly. But I'm sure, like, as a business owner, it is important, right? That the podcast works for your business as well, especially if you want to keep doing it long term. What have you seen in your business? You already mentioned, like, networking has been amazing, and some of your podcast guests have become clients.
Yeah.
But what else have you seen in terms of, well, basically the results from the podcast? Like, what effect has it had on your business?
I think it makes you an authority. I mean, I touched on this a little bit before, but it makes you have like, you got a microphone. So I think it makes you an authority of, it's another medium, and it's out there on the internet. So when somebody searches you up, and then comes up your podcast, and it's another bit of social proof, and it does matter. So it's like, oh, people introduce me. She's got a podcast. Like, that's a thing. She's got a podcast. And now, who knew 1 year would turn into almost 5? So now it's like, oh, I've got a podcast that's almost 5 years old. That sounds like something, So I think it does add street cred.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, episode 250, that also definitely means something. And that experience and knowing that many people over so many interviews. Have you always done interviews, or have you also done some solo episodes on the podcast?
No, I don't do solo episodes. For me, I don't think they have the same breadth or energy. I find that if, they're just much more interesting when there's two people, we're laughing and sort of vibing off each other, and it's casual. For my fear of solo episodes, there's many times where if I take the conversation from A to B to C, but if I'm talking to somebody, it might go from A to D to E and be much more interesting, because you don't know what their questions are. So I've never done a solo episode. There are definitely people who do it, but I don't think it's a good fit for the energy I want in my show. I
Yeah,
think it just
exactly.
starts to become
Okay.
like you're talking to your diary. Like you just, for me, it's just like, somehow at some point you're preaching because you're not having a conversation with yourself.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Absolutely. And I think it makes a lot of sense, and it sounds like you know what works for you. And I think that's the cool thing about podcasting, right? You have all this freedom. There are so many different formats, so you can see what works. Like if interviews sound really intimidating, then maybe starting with solo episodes if that feels less intimidating. But on the other hand, if you don't want to do solo episodes, like you don't have to.
No,
It's
you don't.
amazing.
And
You
I
don't have
think the
to.
solo episodes are less forgiving. Talking to somebody and just talk to them like, I'm talking to you here. I'm looking you in the eye. We're chatting. If somebody else happens to listen to this conversation, great. But if I was doing this by myself, there is the component of presentation where I have to mind my words and, oh, I messed up that sentence. Whereas I'm talking and I mess up a sentence, you'll just keep talking. You knew what I meant. So for me, I also think it's more forgiving to have a guest.
Yeah, exactly. So from when you started, when you're thinking back 5 years ago, is there anything that you wish you knew before you started the podcast? Because you had the systems already set up because it's what you do. So that's like quite a unique situation for you compared to many other podcasters. But was there anything that you learned in the past 5 years that you're like, oh, I wish I knew that before I started?
I think for me, it's more comforting to have a backlog. There's only been 1 or 2 times where I've got down to say 4 episodes, and I think, oh, we only have a month in the bank. That makes me a little anxious. So I probably didn't realize as soon in the beginning that I could use that as an honor. Like if I see somebody on LinkedIn, hey, do you want to be my episode? Because here's why, right? And
Mhm.
so, yeah, so I think I just like for my sake what I learned is I'm more comfortable having having more things in the queue. So I
Yeah.
like to be a minimum of we got 3 months ahead. Anything less than that makes me a little squirrely.
Wow, 3 months. That's awesome. That's really
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, I totally agree though. I like having some things recorded, and we're recording this episode now in August, but it's probably October now that you're listening to this.
Yeah.
So, this is also recorded a good like 2 months probably ahead of time. Yeah, it makes me a lot more comfortable as well. Do you batch record or do you just schedule one or two?
No, no, usually one day a month I'll do like 5 or 6 episodes.
Awesome. Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that too. Absolutely. Okay, so I'm also really curious, maybe as a final question, how did you get those huge names on your show? Tell us the secret.
Secret. I think just one person led me to another, and sometimes I just asked, right? A lesser name to you might be Marcus Sheridan, but he wrote this book called "You Ask." Oh my gosh, Ask You Ask I Tell. I always get his title backwards, but anyhow, I loved his book, and I had somebody else on the show, and he had written the foreword to his book, and I'm like, oh my gosh, could I please have an introduction? And they did, and they let him come on the show. Now, to me, he was a big deal. What I find is once you get one big deal, then you can throw the names around to the other people. And so then one attracts the others. So that helps.
Cool. So the secret is just ask.
Yeah, I just asked. I just got lucky. I got in the right spot at the right time. I asked. And once one person says yes, then you can use that to leverage another person.
Yeah, that's great advice for sure. Okay, cool. Well, Kris, thank you so much for sharing your secrets, but also your journey, your podcasting journey with us today. I think it was really interesting to hear what the past 5 years of podcasting has brought you and your business, and how you leverage your podcast for your business as an excellent networking tool, but also to meet your audience where they're at before they're even looking at hiring a productivity
Yeah.
coach, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us, and we'll also link these in the show notes, but can you tell us where people can find you and your podcast online?
Yeah, you can look me up anywhere, like on the platforms, Win the Hour, Win the Day podcast. You can check me out on LinkedIn and tell me you heard me on this fantastic podcast, the Podcast Babes, and we'll become fast friends. Or you can go to www.free, FREEGIFT, free gift from Kris, KRIS.com, freegiftfromkris.com. And excuse me, we even have a free audio version that we're not going to keep up very long, but it's there for your audience. We also have a business personality quiz you might get a kick out of. Takes a few seconds, customized results. So yeah, check that out, freegiftfromkris.com, and reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Amazing. We love a free gift. So that sounds really good. Also, just wanted to mention the latest episode of your podcast right now, as we're recording this, is actually about storytelling. So we'll link that one in the show notes as well, because I think for every podcaster, it's a really good episode to start with. So make sure to listen to Kris's storytelling episode. I think it's super interesting and a must listen for all podcasters. Well, Kris, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was really good having you here today.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for today's episode. Need some help to get your podcast off the ground? Not sure where to start and what to focus on? Go to thepodcastbabes.com to schedule a call and learn more about our podcast launch and production services. See you next week.